So we proceed with the next speaker. Next speaker who is Josh Bongard, who is actually the co-author of Ross' book, How the Body Shapes How We Think. And so he's supposed to talk about the topic, what we think about when we think of thinking machine. So nice to see you, Josh, and thank you for joining us, given the fact that it's very early in the morning there. Thank you.
Good morning, my pleasure. Good morning, Fabio, and good morning to all of you. I'm calling in this morning from the University of Vermont, and as Fabio mentioned, it's very early in the morning here, so I apologize if I'm not perfectly coherent. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I seem to have some technical issues with sharing my screen, so I've asked Nathan to advance my slides for me. I realize we're running a little bit behind, so I'll abbreviate a little bit of my talk. I'm going to talk today about evolutionary robotics. I understand you've heard a little bit of that from Professor Hafner when she lectured on cognition from scratch. So my lab, we work in the area of evolutionary robotics, and we try, rather than building robots, to evolve them to study adaptive behavior, regardless of whether we're talking about machines or organisms. So Nathan, if you can advance the next slide. All of you are probably familiar with most of the state-of-the-art in robotics. I think in the interest of time, I won't play this video. There's been a lot of advances in robotics in the last few years, but if you advance to the next slide, if you can play this one for me, Nathan. This is Marc Raibert's 3D Biped built at the MIT AI lab back in 1992, and as you can see here, very sophisticated sensor motor control over 23 years ago. So I used the video of Big Dog and the video of the 3D Biped from 1992 to illustrate that in some ways we've made a lot of advances in robotics, but in other ways our advances have been somewhat limited. We're able to make sophisticated machines that exhibit one sensor motor coordination task well, but the range, the environmental range in which it can perform that action is relatively limited. Next slide, please. I use these four images to try and drive home this fact that, of course, we can make very advanced machines, we can make Big Dog, we can make industrial robots. What's very difficult in robotics, and which we've heard from the other lecturers today, is we're not able to make adaptive machines, machines that can continue to operate as the environment around them changes. So on construction sites, we still do not have adaptive and autonomous machines. On a construction site, we might want robots that do nothing more complicated than move bricks from pile A to pile B, but of course, any one construction site is different from one case to the next. If you can advance to the next slide, please, Nathan, and if you can play the simulated robot video. So in evolutionary robotics, we try and borrow ideas from evolution because evolution has been able to produce not just autonomous organisms and adaptive organisms, but organisms that can exhibit a large number of behaviors. So they can broaden the range of environments in which they can survive, and so on. So what you're watching now is just a summary of an evolutionary robotics experiment. So this was work actually done while I was a PhD student in Rolf's lab. You're watching a snapshot partway through an evolutionary simulation. In this case, we have 16 robots that have evolved to locomote, as you can see here. They're all genetically very similar to one another, but you can see now that they're starting to diverge slightly in their behavior. Some of these robots are now going to bump into one another and run out of steam, but there are two robots towards the top of the video that continue to move a little bit faster than the other 14 robots. So when this video ends, those two robots that are moving a little bit faster survive, and the other 14 robots are deleted. The computer takes those two robots, makes copies of them, and when it copies them, it introduces a slight random mistake to either the controller or the morphology. And by iterating through this process, we can evolve a robot that is adaptive or robust. And then in some cases, if we evolve a robot that's sufficiently interesting or complex, we might go to the added effort of 3D printing part or these days all of the robot. So if you could play the next video. This is actually a robot taken from a separate experiment, but I think you get the basic idea. So evolve populations of robots in simulation, and then manufacture a physical version of one or more of those evolved robots. So that's the basic recipe for evolutionary robotics. And as I mentioned, the main goal in evolutionary robotics is to try and get adaptive machines that gradually broaden their capabilities so they can perform more and more behaviors robustly in a wider and wider range of environments. That's the long-term goal for evolutionary robotics. Next slide, please. So here's a schematic showing you the basic idea of evolutionary robotics. So in the top row, you can see a number of robots, and the gray represents the bodies or morphologies of those robots, and the circles and lines represent neurons and synapses of their controllers. So this is meant just to highlight the fact that, again, in evolutionary robotics, we're trying not just to optimize the controller of the robot, but also the body of the robot. If we want to investigate issues in embodied cognition, we want to explore the space of bodies and controllers. Okay, so in the top row, you can see robots that have different morphologies and controllers. The ones that do well survive and produce offspring into the next generation. Those that don't do such a good job die off, and we repeat this process indefinitely. Okay, next slide, please, Nathan. So again, just in the interest of time, I'm going to very, very briefly touch on a recent project we did in the area of modularity. So the reason I chose this experiment to talk a little bit about is I think it highlights one of the advantages of evolving both morphology and control. So in this project, we were interested in modularity. Modularity, generally speaking, is the idea that you have a network where in that network there are certain parts of the network that are densely connected, and those densely connected subsets or modules in the network are sparsely or not connected at all to other modules. In evolutionary biology, modularity has been studied for a long time because modularity, like in engineered systems, has an advantage, which is that if you do have a system made up of a number of modules, you can tinker or change one module or improve that module without disrupting the function of the other module. The mystery that's existed in biology for a long time is how does modularity evolve in the first place? Once you have it, it's useful because evolution can mutate and modify and improve one module without disrupting the other. But getting it to evolve in the first place is mysterious. So this little cartoon that you see here, this is taken from a paper by the evolutionary biologist Günter Wagner back in the late 1990s, and he put forward a theoretical argument for why modularity would evolve in the first place. And this cartoon is my attempt to try and illustrate his argument. So imagine that we have a hypothetical four-legged organism, like the one that you see on the left here. And imagine that there would be an evolutionary advantage for this organism's children if the children had longer legs but the same body size. So that's the hypothetical organism you see on the right-hand side. If that's the case, that means that there is stabilizing selection acting on the body over evolutionary time. In essence, evolution is trying to hold the size of the body fixed, and there is directional selection acting on the organism's legs. So directional selection means there's evolutionary pressure to change a particular trait, which in this case is the length of the legs. So Professor Wagner argued that if you have this situation where one part of the body evolution is trying to keep the same and another part of the body evolution is trying to change, there's an advantage to modularity. So if you can advance to the next slide. In this next slide here, we can see that this hypothetical organism has a gene network which is illustrated with the green circles you see in the top left. In this case, we have a gene network that's non-modular. Each gene influences every other gene. So if a mutation occurs, represented by the M there, if a mutation occurs to the leg genes, that might actually lengthen the legs. But because this is a non-modular gene network, the mutation will spread, or the effect of the mutation will spread to the other genes that control the body, and the body will also increase in size. So this non-modular genome does not allow the organism to produce children that satisfy stabilizing selection and directional selection. Next slide, please. Imagine we have exactly the same organism, but this organism has a different genome, and that genome is modular. The leg genes do not influence the body genes and vice versa. Now we can imagine a mutation that does lengthen the legs and does not affect body size. So this is a theoretical argument for why modularity might evolve. This particular organism with this modular genome has an evolutionary advantage over the previous one, which did not have a modular genome, because it's able to match these two conditions of stabilizing and directional selection. Next slide, please, Nathan. So I'm not going to go into the details of this experiment, but I'm just going to talk about the hypothesis. So back now from biology to evolutionary robotics, if we want to have robots for which we can evolve more and more functionality, we would like to be able to keep part of the functionality in a modular system and allow evolution to gradually improve another part of the system. So what happens then, what morphology allows directional selection to act on one part of the robot's body and stabilizing selection to act on the other part of the body? So again, I've tried to illustrate this hypothesis with the cartoon that you see here. So in the top row here, we see a particular robot arm, and this robot arm is evolving to pick up these circles and put them on these shelves. And it turns out that this particular morphology, for whatever reason, does not allow stabilizing selection and directional selection to act on it. The robot evolution is not able to change one part of the body while leaving the other part of the body fixed. So because this robot is non-modular, you can see in the top right panel that all the neurons are attached to all their neighbors, so there's no modules here. And because it's not modular, evolution can't make much progress, and this robot only evolves to pick up 2 of the 6 circles here. In the lower row, imagine there's a robot with a different morphology, and there is something about this morphology that allows this stabilizing and directional selection to act on it. If stabilizing and directional selection can act on this different body, then there is an advantage to having a modular controller. That modular controller evolves, and you can see in the bottom right panel, this modular controller, you can see that the neurons in the hand are all connected, and the neurons in the arm are all connected, but there are no connections between the neurons in the hand to the arm and vice versa. So there's something about this morphology that favors neural controllers, and if you have a modular controller, there's an advantage here, which makes things easier for evolution. Evolution proceeds, and this robot does a much better job than the robot with the non-modular controller. So I apologize, it's a little bit of a complicated hypothesis here, but I wanted to try and explain it because here in evolutionary robotics, we can now understand the conditions under which we evolve a robot that can do more and more things, which in this cartoon is to pick up objects of different sizes and different positions, because it has the right kind of morphology that evolution can act on. Okay, I think in the interest of time, Nathan will skip over the detailed results from this experiment. I'm happy to point people to the research paper if they'd like more details. So you can skip over slide 11. 12, 13, 14, and let's move on. 15, you can skip over 15, please. 16. Okay. You can leave it here for a moment, please. So what I just described to you was an experiment that unites evolution, morphology, and neural control. I'd like to briefly talk about a growing research focus in our lab, which is the crowdsourcing of robotics. So if we want to evolve robots, we're going to have to do it on a very large scale. We can evolve hundreds of robots in a supercomputer, but if we have thousands of people contributing computation from their laptops, maybe we can evolve something beyond what we could do with just a supercomputer. So I'm going to talk briefly about a recent project that we just published on. This is the Dotbot project, which is a form of crowdsourcing robotics. You can see the URL there, so you can go and try the Dotbot project for yourself. This was a project carried out by my PhD student, Marc. And the idea here was to see if we can draw on people's intuition to scale up the number of robots that we evolve. So if you play this video here, you can see the Dotbot project in action. So what you're watching here is a user in a web page creating the morphology of a robot. So every segment here, every line becomes a segment, and every dot is a joint connecting those segments together. So in this case, the human creates the body, and then once they create the body and click go, that body is placed in a physics engine, and their computer takes over and evolves a brain for the robot. So humans make the robot bodies, and their computers evolve brains for those robots. Next slide, please. In this next video here, you're going to see 4 different users on the web making 4 different robot bodies. And again, when these users click go, they optimize controllers for those robots. So what we were interested in here is, do non-roboticists have intuition about movement? We've all witnessed moving animals, and we all have an intuitive understanding of biomechanics because we ourselves are moving animals. Can we exploit the intuition of the crowd to help us to explore the space of all possible robots? So combine social dynamics with evolutionary dynamics. Next slide, please. So in this experiment, we now have this evolutionary robotics simulation running in a web page. We deployed it to the web, and over a period of several weeks, we had a total of almost 1,000 people come and visit the site. We conducted what's known as a single blind study, which means from the point of view of the user, they're blind to whether they're placed in the control group, which you see on the left, or whether they're placed into the experimental group, which you can see on the right. In the control group on the left, users could create robot bodies and evolve controllers for them, but they could only see their own designs. They could only see the robots that they themselves created. In the experimental group, which you see on the right, they saw almost the same interface, but in addition, they also saw at the top of their screen robots that had been created by other users, and you can't see it in this image, but underneath each of those little robot bodies, there's a number which is how far they've evolved to move. So users in the experimental group can see robots created by others, and they can see how well or how poorly those robots evolved to move. In the control group, the 364 users created a total of 1,245 robots, and the 398 users in the experimental group created 1,136 robots altogether. For each one of those robots, the users' computers evolved many, many controllers. So this was a relatively large-scale evolutionary robotics experiment. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll just ask you to focus on the blue and the green curves for a moment. So the horizontal axis here reports the 3 weeks over which we ran the experiment, and the vertical axis represents the best robot evolved by each group at that point in time. So the green curve represents the best robots produced by the control group, which were the users that could only see their own designs. And we terminated that experiment after about a week's time. And in the blue curve represents the best robots evolved by the experimental group that could see each other's designs. And we performed some statistics on the green and the blue curve, and the experimental users, the blue curve, they were definitely doing a better job than the control group, which suggests that seeing each other's designs allowed users to disseminate or spread their intuitions. Here's a particular design that works well. Others saw that design and innovated and altered that design a little bit and spread those good ideas and so on. So that answered the question that yes, non-roboticists have intuition about movement, and we can exploit that intuition for enriching our evolutionary robotics experiments. Not only do they have intuition, but they can broadcast that intuition to other users, and other users can build upon the intuitions of the original users. Now I'll ask you to focus on the red curve. In the red curve, we now asked computers to not only evolve the controllers, but also to evolve the body plans. So this is now a completely automated group with no human users. We use the state-of-the-art evolutionary algorithm, and it turns out that the computers do a much worse job than people. So for us evolutionary roboticists, this was a little depressing to begin with. After years of research, we couldn't do any better than a collection of non-experts. But in subsequent work, which I don't have time to talk about today, we took this idea one step further, and we explored an idea that we now call crowd seeding. So in crowd seeding, we look at all of the robots that are produced by the human users and extract the features of the robot bodies that are common to the good robots, and we also extract all of the features of the robots that are common, or all of the features that are common to the poorly behaving robot, and ask a computer to do some machine learning. So the computer, in essence, learns what is it about the crowd-generated robots that did so well, and what is it about the crowd-generated robots that caused those robots to do poorly. So the computers, through machine learning, distill down the features that predict good robot body plans, and now the computer uses those features to evolve robots that not only perform the task we want the robots to perform, but also that the robots exhibit in their body plans good features that the crowd focused on. And now, and I don't have that curve here, now the computer does better than humans alone. So the first result was a little bit depressing for us as evolutionary roboticists, but in the long term we got an interesting and optimistic result, which is humans alone do pretty well, computers alone do very poorly, but if we combine people and computers together in the right way, we combine social dynamics and evolutionary dynamics, the combined human and computer team can evolve better robots than either humans or computers alone. So that's pretty exciting for us, and that's some recent work. And again, I'm happy to share those research papers if people are interested. Next slide, please. We also went to the effort of building a very state-of-the-art physical robot version of this. So Nathan, if you can play this video for me. This was the best robot produced by the crowd. We built this out of Lego Mindstorms, so state-of-the-art robot technology here. This particular robot had 209 human authors. So this was kind of interesting because in the end, we do get a physical robot, but it's not a robot designed by a professor or a few of his or her graduate students, but designed collectively by the crowd. Okay, let's move on to the last slide here, and then I'll finish up. I'd like to finish up with, again, an advertisement for an online course that we now run on Reddit. There's the URL. This is the Ludobots online course, which was inspired by the ShanghAI Lectures. Ludobots is organized a little bit differently. The emphasis here is not so much on lectures, but the emphasis is on a series of programming projects. You can see the spine of this tree here. These large blue dots represent these programming projects where students gradually build their own, or program their own evolutionary robotics simulation. And at the end of that, they're now able to evolve their own robots on their own computers towards the end of the course. And the starburst pattern that you see at the bottom of this tree, all of those small blue circles are new projects that are posed by students that are now tackled by the next students that come to the course. So the idea behind Ludobots, if you come and try this course out, you can create your own evolutionary robotics simulator, but you can also add and enrich the course by challenging new students to carry out projects that you yourself come up with and post to Ludobots. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, to come and try this out and add your own ideas to this course. Okay, I think I will stop there. Thanks for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you for your very inspiring talk, actually.